All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon here from Denver. It is still hot if you're in the local area. Hopefully, it's going to get cool throughout the summer. My name's Adam, and I work at Tattered Bookstore, and we're Colorado's largest bookstore. Thank you so much for supporting independent bookstores and joining us with this event this afternoon. If you're unfamiliar with Tattered, this is our 50th anniversary. We're expanding. We just opened a new location, and we're opening up a kids specific location out in Aurora. So please follow social media, Tattered Cover, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and you'll have updates on when everything's opening, and follow along there. Before I go any further, I want to inform you that there is closed captioning via YouTube. There's a black bar at the bottom of the screen that should be labeled CC. Click that for closed captioning, and you should have it if you want it or need it. If you have any questions, please put them in the comment bar on the side. I'll type in there in just a second, but please feel free to ask questions at any point. And please visit tattercover.com/event for more virtual author events. We have many. I was just talking to our guests today about how many we have. We have quite a few this week, including Carrie Vaughn presenting Questland and Peter Canellos discussing The Great Dissenter. That's tatteredcover.com/event for more information. This afternoon, I am so excited to introduce the author of The Engagement, America's Quarter-Century Struggle Over Same-Sex Marriage, Sasha Issenberg. Sasha Issenberg is the author of 3 previous books, including The Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns. He has covered presidential elections as a national political reporter for the Washington Bureau of the Boston Globe. He's a columnist for Slate and a contributor to Bloomberg's Politics and Business Week. He is the Washington correspondent at Monocle, and his work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine and George, where he is also a contributing editor. He teaches political science in the political science department at UCLA. Please welcome Sasha Issenberg.
There we go. Hi.
All right. Zoom is interesting. Hey, Sasha, welcome. Thank you for talking about your book here at Tattered Cover. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing all right. It's great to be back in Denver, I guess.
Yeah, virtually. Okay. Yeah. I talked about the weather here in Denver, and I know it's really lame and no one cares, but I'm curious, how's LA's weather right now?
Like same as it ever was, I think.
Yeah. Does it ever change?
Hardly ever. So it seems like a standard day here.
Exactly. So we're not here to talk about weather. We are here to talk about your most recent book, The Engagement, which has a subtitle, obviously, that explains what the book is. But tell me what The Engagement is from your perspective. What is it if you were just pitching it to a stranger on the street?
Yeah, it's about the birth and life of death of a political issue that I think sort of dominated my generation in the United States more than any other, which is the debate over same-sex marriage. And so in a certain way, it is at its core like a political and legal history of the whole arc of this issue from when it sort of emerges accidentally and gets sort of thrust into our politics. The evolution of the sort of legal wrangling over it all the way to the Supreme Court, where in 2015, the court ruled that gay marriage is the law of the land. And in certain ways, I think it kind of functions as something like a secret history of the culture wars during this period, and that it is about the debate over whether two people of the same sex can legally marry. But I think it captures more broadly the sort of the way that so many of the tensions in the I think like roughly the period between like Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump were taken up by sexual politics in the United States, and this became the kind of signal area of conflict.
Yeah, and I remember in high school, which would have been for me early 2000s. I remember my sophomore year of high school, we had to write a debate paper, right? And I talked about same-sex marriage, and it was baffling to me how like my friends or classmates who were 16, 17 in the early 2000s, some were against it, and it was still contentious. With this book, did you want to focus on both sides of the argument, to straight and narrow the facts? How did you try to set this up?
Yeah, so one basic thing is that most of the drama in the book is driven by litigation, legislative fights, ballot fights, which are just fundamentally adversarial. And one of the things, part of the reason I set out to write this a decade ago was that nobody had written a single narrative of the whole arc of this conflict. But to the extent that things had been written, book length things, they had been, or books as we call them in the business, they had overwhelmingly been, some had been written about sort of conflicts in particular states or the trajectory of a particular lawsuit. And they overwhelmingly had been written by folks who just focus on the pro-gay marriage side of the debate. And I think it's pretty clear that most of them, these were written by people who saw themselves as pro-marriage equality. And they wrote often, triumphalist things about the side that they identified with, which is fine. Some of those accounts were quite insightful, but they, in certain respects, were terrible ways about writing about litigation or legislative fights or ballot fights, which, have at least two sides to them. And it is very difficult to understand the strategy or tactics of one side without understanding the strategy and tactics and decision-making of the other side. And so one of the things I was really conscious of in the beginning was, yes, this is a book where the pro-marriage equality side, wins, like spoiler alert. But I wanted to make it, as much about the opponents who are winning this fight in many respects for a large part of it, or were dominant. We're setting the terms of this conflict, at least I'll say, for much of it. I wanted to write about them as much as I wrote about, opponents of same-sex marriage, as much as I wrote about supporters of same-sex marriage. And then the other group is the group that represents, pretty close to a majority of the American people, certainly a plurality, which is people who change their opinions on this. And I suspect that's where a lot of your high school friends were. The latest polling from Gallup suggests, like 27% of Americans supported same-sex marriage rights in 1996. It was 70% when they asked just a week or two ago. And so part of, the big part of this story, and some of those are famous people like Barack Obama, and then some of it's just, the broad American public who moved as this debate sort of shifted their opinions.
Yeah, definitely. And the book is subtitled 25 Years, right? When, I guess, because obviously queerness has been around forever. Was there a defining moment that started the debate, I guess, like 25 years ago, in what's that, the 90s then? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I was very conscious about not trying to make this a history of same-sex partnerships in the United States or elsewhere. Not just queerness has existed forever, but like, two people of the same sex have been hooking up and living in some mutual dependence for a while. There was no society on Earth until the late 1980s that had any formalized recognition for these, legal recognition for these pairings. And this, and I didn't want it to make it a, some omnibus story of LGBT politics. And it's really about this fight over marriage. And so, the reason that the book starts in 1990 is I tell the story of this, really small scale local, like very small scale local fight in Honolulu that basically spirals out of control. And it is, basically a petty rivalry for control of a pride planning committee in Honolulu in 1989, 1990, that, where the central figure is this guy named Bill Woods, who was he was like the gay activist in Hawaii in the 70s and 80s. He was, I think, like many first generation activists in any community or any sphere, was sort of incredibly entrepreneurial, very good at starting things. He started the Gay Community Center, he started the gay newspaper, he had the first gay radio show. Like, he was the first to do all these things. Wasn't terribly good at like building alliances or playing well with others. Was quite good at getting attention for his initiatives. And he ends up in this pride planning group that is being led by these two lesbian women who had just launched a monthly magazine that is now competing with his Gay Community newspaper for what I'm sure you can imagine is a really robust a pool of advertising dollars targeting the LGBT marketplace in Honolulu in 1989. And so there's bad blood between them to begin with. He wants to have a parade. They don't want to have a parade because, frankly, they want to have a picnic and vigil for this pride event, because that's already like enough of a logistical challenge, and a parade just seems like way too much. So they tell it's like basically anybody who's been on an event planning committee will like get PTSD reading this, but they don't want to do this, but they create a subcommittee for him to go look into the parade. He comes back with a report that they ignore. So then he decides he's going to create his own Pride Parade and Rally Council. And now he's trying to find everything he can that can upstage the other Pride picnic. And so he invites the governor to be the grand marshal of his parade. He gets the Royal Hawaiian Jazz Band to agree to perform. He gets a friend of his who's a chef and a caterer to have an international food festival. And he decides he's going to have a wedding. And there have been couples who had been exchanging vows at the Metropolitan Community Church, which was a gay-friendly, sort of non-denominational Protestant congregation in these Holy Union ceremonies where people would, express their commitment to one another, but with no expectation that there was any legal resonance to any of this. And Woods wanted to take some of these couples and have a kind of Mooney-style mass wedding on stage at a rally at the end of his parade. And he was not a lawyer. It's clear from my research he just totally misread the state's marriage law statute and came away with the sincere but misguided impression that if these couples exchange vows, the state might have to legally recognize them as married. And so he goes to the state affiliate of the ACLU and wants the ACLU to back him up if these couples demand recognition. And the ACLU doesn't want to play along with him. I think that they appropriately see that his legal interpretation is sort of bunk. But they also don't want to outright reject him because Woods is kind of like feisty and adversarial enough that if you pick a public fight with him, he'll enjoy it, and who knows where it'll lead. So they basically play this long game through early 1990, trying to delay him so that June will come around, the Pride, he'll run his parade or whatever, and then he'll lose interest in the marriage thing and move on to his next initiative. June comes around, Pride happens, and he's still interested in, there's no wedding ceremony, but he still is into this as much because he's fighting with the ACLU as he is actually interested in this marriage rights issue. And they spend the whole year sort of pawning him off, and he gets enraged by what he sees as the sort of disrespect and manipulation. And on December 17th, 1990, he leads these three couples into the Hawaii office of the Honolulu office of the Hawaii Department of Public Health to request marriage licenses, and they are rejected. And the Attorney General says that the health director was right to reject them under state law. And they end up in the hands of a civil rights attorney who the next year sues the state on their behalf. And to the shock of everybody involved, in the spring of 1993, the Hawaii Supreme Court rules in their favor because it was the first court on earth to rule that the fundamental right to marriage, in this case in the Hawaii state constitution, can extend to same-sex couples. And that's the world, that's where the book starts. And that's the world we live in, where this, long-standing historical impulse among same-sex couples to be together turns into a viable legal objective and a political issue in the way that we think of it.
Yeah, and that's where, I guess modern same-sex marriage kicks off. That's where your book obviously opens. When was the first time you became aware of same-sex marriage as a politicized discussion?
I was born in 1980. I'm 41 now. I certainly remember, and I was probably, as befits the line of work I got into, like an unnecessarily voracious news consumer as a tween. Mm-hmm. I remember the Defense of Marriage Act being a subject for debate in 1996. I would have been 16 at the time. I feel like I have a very frail memory of this Hawaii story, like of Tom Brokaw, and I looked for this clip, I couldn't find it in my research, but like of Tom Brokaw, and then there's like a graphic of like a rainbow over Hawaii, and like Tom Brokaw going like, "Today in Hawaii, the Supreme Court ruled." But I was like aware, but like all the stuff in the 90s, as I recall it, and it's just sort of borne out by having gone back and read and watched a lot of that coverage in my research. So the book treated as a kind of culture war sideshow. And so it was like of a vein where should Two Live Crew be censored, and should the NEH give money to, you know, the guy who made Piss Christ, and should we teach Ebonics in the schools, and should two men be able to marry each other? Like it was the way we talk about like the Dr. Seuss stuff now. Like it was not treated, certainly the way we talk about it now, which is like the defining civil rights movement of our generation, was not the way that this stuff was covered when it flared up. It was flared up as this kind of marginal, crazy thing that we could have good debates on cable news about because it was like engaging and, you know, but I'd never thought of it as during that time. And I think even until, you know, Massachusetts started marrying couples in 2004, I mean, I was a political reporter at that time. I didn't expect that this was something that in my lifetime would become a national, we would end up with this being nationally available. I thought this, you know, this was still sort of treated as, up until that point, I think, as a kind of local curiosity. And, you know, and I think some of that was because folks on the left, including gay rights advocates, sort of accused their opponents not inaccurately of making sport of it. And so it's, you know, not unlike like the critical race theory now, where folks on the left say, you guys are just talking about this because you want to invent an issue and distract from XYZ. And so it was like, that was sort of some part of the conversation. The left was like saying to religious conservatives, you guys are more obsessed with gay marriage than we are because you want to just make a political issue out of it.
For sure. Yeah, because I remember Massachusetts and gay marriage becoming a same-sex marriage becoming an option. Like I said, that was right around when I was in high school writing papers about it. It was something that I was super interested in, just as a human perspective. Like, this is nonsense anyway. But at that time, you're a political reporter. You're writing about many things. Do you start writing about same-sex marriage then, or you're touching other things?
I had never written like really. I'm sure at some point I typed the words gay marriage because, you know, I was a newspaper reporter during the 2008 campaign, but I don't think I ever wrote even a newspaper article about this topic. And I, you know, it was not something that sort of registered high on my radar as a, you know, as a source of particular interest or a conflict that I was drawn to. So, you know, it was really not until sort of 2011 that I sort of took an interest in that. And it was at the same time that I sort of saw this as a right big subject for a book.
Yeah, and what kicked off that interest in writing a book about this in 2011?
Yeah, so in 2011, I was working on a book called The Victory Lab, which was about the science of political campaigns. And so I was having a lot of conversations that year with pollsters or people who, in some form or another, worked with measuring voter attitudes. And they would over and over again, in the context of other conversations, make a version of the same point, which is they never seen opinion on a single issue move as quickly as they'd seen it move on marriage. Mm-hmm. And none of these people had a really good explanation for, you know, as to what had happened. And it struck me then, like I had been alive through the whole life of this issue. I'd covered politics through most of it. I had sort of come around to the idea that we had, you know, as a country, moved a significant distance already. And I had no idea how we got from wherever there was to wherever here was. I had no idea how this became an issue that we talked about, and how certainly it had emerged as, you know, I think in the sort of 2000s, you know, really being launched around the Massachusetts case, but for years as like the most divisive social cultural issue in the country. You know, I think we would have said that about abortion before. We might say it about abortion again. That was true of the death penalty for a while. Probably true of immigration for a number of years. And like clearly that was true of same-sex marriage. And I just didn't understand the arc of that. And I was sort of surprised when I went to try to read about it that nobody had put this together in a major account. And we were already starting to talk about this as the, you know, defining civil rights movement of our time, or the most important social movement. And still, it was only 6 or 7 states, I think, at this point that had legalized same-sex marriage. So we're nowhere near where we were just a few years later. But it was I could already start to see that we were reaching consensus. Support was approaching 50%, and it seemed like there was only one way. By then, only one way that the trajectory was going to go. And I had been shaped, starting in high school and college, reading a lot of big books about the civil rights movement that were written starting in like the mid to late 70s by mostly journalists who, took the first sort of stab at making sense. This is the racial equality civil rights movement. Took the first stab at sort of, piecing together this really sort of varied story that took place over decades in a whole bunch of states, political, legal, the whole thing. And it seemed to me that the time had come that one could begin to approach the marriage debate with a sort of similar toolkit and a similar set of curiosities and a similar ambition. And so, that was, I decided I wanted to make it my next book.
Where do you start? I know you mentioned like you looked for Tom Brokaw, or that video that you had in mind, and you just kind of said there wasn't a lot official about everything. Where did you start?
Yeah, so the one thing, so my other books, I wrote a book about the global sushi business. I wrote a book about medical tourism. I wrote a book about the science of political campaigns. In each of those, I define the subject matter and by extension, the scope of the narrative. So I decided that, the innovations in the world of political campaigns that I were interested in were experiments and the use of data. And I was not that interested in other things. And so there's internet in my book because I just sort of decided like this is in and this is out. In my sushi book, I decided, I sort of knew what the themes were. I said, I'm going to tell this story through tuna, not through salmon. So there's not much about salmon in my book. And, the one thing about taking something that's externally meaningful, which is, within a few months of me starting the book, this is moving towards the Supreme Court. The same-sex marriage debate exists apart from my conception of what it includes or not, right? Obviously, there are all sorts of sort of discretionary decisions that I, as a researcher and author, make, but this thing exists in the real world. There are court cases, there were legislative fights, there were interest groups. I can't really cherry pick which of them are part of my story or not. And so the first thing is basically coming up with a timeline of the major court cases, state level political fights, when various sort of activist players got involved in it. And what, some of those had been written about in a discreet way. There had not been anything good written about how they interact with one another. And so some part of the research is understanding, okay, yes, there was a lawsuit in Vermont. The Vermont Supreme Court rules in 1999 in favor of gay marriage plaintiffs, but tells the state, you have to give equal benefits to gay and lesbian couples, but you don't actually have to let them marry. And then the legislature comes up with this institution of civil unions. That got well documented at the time. There's a guy who was writing op-eds for local papers in Vermont who won a Pulitzer Prize for them. He wrote a book about it. It got national news coverage at the time. People knew that was a significant thing. And so that wasn't a secret, but nobody had really explained how, and then there's this Hawaii case, which had gotten less coverage because it had been earlier. And then the Defense of Marriage Act, which got coverage, but nobody explained how the Defense of Marriage Act really intersected with what happened in Hawaii. And then how what happened in Vermont, grew out of what happened in Hawaii. So some part of the real, research challenge is sort of stitching together the invisible links between these kind of landmark moments. And, one of the great things about that as a period in time, the 90s into the 2000s, is it was just far enough in the past that a lot of documentary material had already been left to libraries and archives that I could go get access to. Something that's not true if I were writing about, a lawsuit from a few years ago. But also almost all the major players were still alive, and most were willing to talk to me. And you go back a lot farther in the past and you get maybe some more documentary material, but fewer live subjects, and you do stuff contemporaneously as a lot of daily, weekly, monthly journalism is, and you get maybe more live subjects who are around, but there's not a place where you can go and find a sort of publicly available repository of documents. And so it turns into this very sweet spot historically, I think, for a type of research where often I was able to go to the papers of groups or lawyers or politicians who were involved in these fights, get a lot of contemporaneous material, and then actually go and interview them or interview people who work with them. And like, I joked because I was going to see these lawyers, like I was playing deposition, and like I would go with my iPad loaded up with documents and say like, oh, so you wrote this memo in 1994 about how you saw the results of the Hawaii case or whatever, can you tell me what you were thinking? And they look and go, oh wow, I haven't thought about this in 20 years. And they read and they go, oh, but no, okay. So I did it here. I sent it. I CC'd this person. I must have been doing that because I thought that it would be for this and that. And like now I, as a writer, have not just what was on paper contemporaneously, but I'm able to reconstruct the calculations and motivations of somebody in real time and then bounce that off of other people that they were interacting with. And that was, so much of this book, certainly the first part of this book, is people on all sides ideologically in all sorts of different roles responding to the emergence of a new issue that they had never even thought about before, had never had to contend with. Their groups didn't have positions on same-sex marriage. Politicians weren't being asked for their opinions on it. And part of what I wanted the reader to do is experience, to be alongside these politicians, lawyers, activists, as they were kind of wrestling with this anew. And I think one of the challenges, obviously, writing retrospectively, especially if people don't have really robust diaries or journals, and I think a lot of lawyers are smart enough not to put things down on paper, or if they're not willing to, not available to talk to you, that you often can't get the texture of their initial uncertainties, and they're wrestling with the calculations because all you see is the result of their decision making. And so that's sort of how I got started. And and then with time I sort of realized, okay, who are the characters? It's very much a character driven narrative. You're with people at every point of this. Who are the characters who allow me to tell part of this story? Who does the reader stay close to as through certain phases? And how do I, in wanting to, as we talked about, like tell both sides of the story, shift perspective so that the reader is sort of seeing this from all the different sides?
One thing that interests me is, did you come across people trying to, I guess, protect their current image? That is to say, maybe in 1994, they weren't necessarily pro same-sex marriage, but now they are, and they were trying to like bury the fact that they weren't, whatever you want to say, like on with it.
Yeah. So like some of the so some of it is not so much people trying to pretend that their actual position was different than it was. Mm-hmm. You get a lot of rationalizations, I think some of which are sound. Mm-hmm. Some which are self-serving, some which are sound and self-serving. Where, I didn't speak to him for the book, but, Bill Clinton sort of has gone through this very public effort, and Hillary too, to a lesser degree, effort to sort of explain away the Defense of Marriage Act. And it's not like we were really pro-gay marriage at the time. It is more along the lines of either, if he'd vetoed it, they would have overridden the veto, or they would have given him something worse. And there's something to that, although there are a whole bunch of like lies that about the particulars that they're sort of dishonest about. I mean, one of the great ironies is that, there are a bunch of people around Barack Obama who, I don't know if they are to what extent they are doing this solely to protect his reputation, but like effectively their cover is, we assumed he was really pro-gay marriage all along and he was just lying out of political opportunism. And that's interesting because it now seems sort of worse to say, and David Axelrod is pretty, I mean, I interviewed him for my book. He also wrote about this in his memoir. He basically says he thought Obama, I think he says, was bullshitting when he said that he opposed gay marriage in 2008 because of his, Christian faith, that the marriage is between a man and a woman. And so it's pretty remarkable that these people who are think it is more serving to Obama's historical reputation to argue that he wasn't actually morally wrong on the issue. He just chose as a political figure to lie about it. And then one of the great examples, there's a guy named Matt Daniels, who's a significant character in this book. He comes along in 1999. He launches something called the Alliance for Marriage, which was the first single issue anti-gay marriage group on the right. And Daniels is like, I think he's like, he's a good-looking 30-something-year-old Ivy League graduate who gets this kind of, I guess, doesn't look like sort of religious conservatives. He is certainly less outwardly kind of adversarial, gets great press coverage, and he's very politically savvy. And I sort of write about how he is smart about building an ecumenical coalition, so that like a multiracial ecumenical coalition. So it's not just evangelical Protestants who are coming out, but he finds, folks in the Black church, he finds Orthodox Jews, he gets religious Asian denominations, and he comes out and he's the person who pushes the federal marriage amendment, the effort to amend the U.S. Constitution, develops the first text of the amendment and gets it in front of Congress. And so he's getting tons of press coverage. He's profiled in The Atlantic. He's on the front page of USA Today. He's on TV. Not a shy fellow in the years 2000, 2001, 2002. And always with this kind of golden boy, is he the new future of the religious right? And so, I was like, I knew he was going to be an important figure in this book, and I was trying to find him to interview him. And like the Alliance for Marriage disappeared like 15 years ago. His name is Matthew Daniels. It's not easy to Google, or it's easy to Google. Everything's easy to Google. It's not easy to know that you're finding what you want to find. And like, the guy just sort of like disappeared. Like he's in the newspaper all the time, and then he just kind of disappears like 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. And eventually I find, somebody online who's at some like global affairs think tank in DC, whose name is Matthew Daniels, who seems like he's the right age and went to the same university in his bio. And like, I look around and it must be the same guy. Firstly, he doesn't answer any of my emails, but like, must be the same, but his bio, his LinkedIn, everything does not mention the Alliance for Marriage. Mm-hmm. Like, just totally memory hold what had been the source of his national, recognition, celebrity for several years. And now it's as though he never did this thing for 4 or 5 years. And that was the most striking example of something I saw on a smaller scale, which is that people who are on the losing side of this issue are far more. I still got a good number of them to talk to me, and even when they didn't, I was able through documents and other reporting methods to sort of reconstruct some of their activity. But it was much harder to get people who had been on the anti-gay marriage side of this debate to talk than the pro-gay marriage side of the debate.
Yeah, definitely. And I have a few more questions. If there's people in the audience that have questions, please put them in the YouTube chat. One thing I want to loop back about, and this is a small question, you don't have to go too in depth on it. How many? Yeah, just like this is a guesstimate. From actually writing to the research portion, what percentage was just strictly research, just you gathering things?
I'm terrible at this because I do it all sort of simultaneously. Sure. I need to start writing to understand my research. And then as I start writing, I realize, often it takes me starting to write something and realize like, I usually don't have like writer's block type things. And often if I do have trouble writing something, it's because I don't actually understand the causal relationship between two things, or I don't understand why a character did something. And then I realize that that's fundamentally not a writing failure, it's a reporting failure. And it's like, I need to go back and re-interview them to understand their motivations at the time, or I need to go back and do a whole bunch of other research because like, I think that I'm having trouble writing a transitional sentence. It's because I actually don't know what that paragraph has to do with this paragraph. And that's a problem that I can only solve with more research. I will say that the writing, and this is true of all my books, is not, I mean, it's a long book. It took a lot of time to write. I don't want to pretend that it didn't, but that's, I think probably in terms of both time and certainly in terms of like emotional ardor and like energy expended and problem solving, that to me has always been the easier part of this.
For sure. And the book did take, I think you said 11 years.
It was 10 years. It was 10 years from sort of conception to publication.
Yeah. So a decade in this timeline is, I mean, a lot obviously shifted. Are you, while you're writing, rewriting things because history is changing right in front of you, what's the actual structure of you writing it? And you mentioned it's pretty easy if you have the reporting done.
Yeah, so one of the things that happens is, so I sold the proposal in the late spring of 2012. And at the time, I didn't have any expectation there would be a Supreme Court case on marriage, let alone a resolution of this at the Supreme Court during the time I was working on it. My initial deadline, I believe, was February of 2015. And so there were 2 rounds of the court accepting appeals on this issue. And each time we, by mutual agreement with my publisher, we reset my deadline so that we have the same goal, and me doing a book that came out, after or before a big Supreme Court case that I didn't wrestle with, that sort of let my book expire pretty quickly, wasn't in anybody's interest. So the real challenging thing was, as big news was breaking on this, especially as somebody who's been a, newspaper reporter, magazine editor, was kind of like turning off some part of my news metabolism, so that, I just sort of came to the recognition that it'll be very hard in real time for me to do any reporting as cases move towards the Supreme Court that will hold. And if there's anything good to report on legal strategies or whatever heading, in cases that are going to the Supreme Court, it'll be in the New York Times by the end of the week, or maybe I could come back after it in a year and see, but that like being part of a pack covering the news was like not, so I went to the Supreme Court for oral arguments, and I, had the novel experience for me of being in the court at a sort of, important historic moment, but there's just not a lot of like, frankly, value I can add when stuff's getting that much scrutiny. And so there were also these, moments in 2013, 14, 15, where there were major court hearings, or there's a big trial in Detroit that I was, following closely for news coverage, but I sort of made a decision. It is more useful for me to be in an archive in Hawaii, or at, the LGBT Community Archive Center archive in Burlington, Vermont, this day, digging through stuff from 1997, than it would be to, be the 27th reporter in a press huddle at the courthouse in Detroit. And so, but I was cognizant of that during that time, that the scope of my book was changing, that, eventually became clear it would have an ending. I didn't think that my book would have a tidy ending when I started it. So, but what was useful for me was knowing that, and then there was a bunch of reporting I had to go back and do that wasn't about the Supreme Court case, but like all of a sudden, it becomes Obergefell, which is the 2015 decision, is a consolidation of 4 cases from Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee that get appealed together to the court. Jim Obergefell is challenging Ohio's 2004 ban. And so it then became clear to me that I needed to do more research than I might have otherwise on what happened in Ohio in 2004. Mm-hmm. So you're reading it in the 2004 context, but then a decade later, it's the Supreme Court is taking that case, and that, that that the reader needs a certain amount of background from that. And so I always had enough reporting on the early stuff to do that I was not kind of getting waylaid by news.
Mm-hmm. And
that was the biggest tension for me, was figuring out how to balance my attention at that time.
Yeah. And then you mentioned your book has a tidy ending. The Supreme Court makes its decision. Maybe this isn't an actual question, but with the last 4 years with Trump, we've seen like anything can happen, like things we never a reality show host was president for 4 years.
Yeah, so I've heard.
Yeah, allegedly he was president. I don't know what he was doing. Where is same-sex marriage safe? Is there a possibility somehow a religious tyrant comes in and, you know what I mean? I don't know where.
Yeah,
there's no
question to ask. So I think that obviously we're now almost 50 years after Roe v. Wade, and we've seen that there's been an active effort for 50 years by folks who are on the losing side of that decision to get back to the Supreme Court, or initially to amend the Constitution when that clearly wasn't going to happen, and then to get back to the Supreme Court to challenge the central holding of Roe, which is that the right to privacy includes a woman's right to an abortion. And I do not see a similar effort underway or likely to emerge to get to the central holding of Obergefell, which is that the fundamental right to marriage applies to same-sex couples. Mm-hmm. I do not see political, or I don't see like rhetoric from conservative politicians that even just talks, people have really grand claims about what the future is going to be like. Don't put that in their list of things. I don't see, it's not entirely clear to me how you would even mount a suit anytime soon. They got the court back to that question. The court is really reticent to revisit precedent, and certainly not a few years afterwards without a very good reason to do so. And it's hard for me to imagine how you would persuade the court to, and it also would introduce a whole bunch of instability into American life. Not just couples who got married during this period when it was legal, but couples who said, "Oh, I chose not to get married because I thought I could get married in a year." And now the Supreme Court and the court, I think regardless of ideology, justices do not want the Supreme Court to be a source of instability or chaos in American life. And so that's all a long way of saying I do not think that we'll see something similar to Roe where, there's an effort to undo Obergefell. Now, that said, what we have seen, and there's just a case that was decided this past week called Fulton versus City of Philadelphia. They're about these religious liberty, religious freedom exemptions. And this was basically, I think the way of looking at this is even before Obergefell was decided in 2015, the anti-gay marriage side knew that they were going to lose. And so even before then, they kind of got into this defensive crouch. And part of that meant basically giving up on changing the law so that it reflected their values on marriage, and instead saying that they deserve to be sheltered from imposition of the law in ways that interfered with religious belief. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that we are, in the early part of a long conflict over not whether a state, for example, can say that gay couples can't marry, but how far private actors can go in saying that they don't want to have to respect or interact with those marriages. And so, there's a case a couple of years ago from Colorado, which was a baker, this guy Jack Phillips, Masterpiece Cake Shop, who did not who said that it interfered with his freedom of expression and religious beliefs to be forced to make custom cakes for two men who had gotten married. He's now fighting sort of separately on a transgender, a cake for a transgender birthday, I believe is what it was. This case that just came to the court was about the right of a Catholic social service agency to say that it would not place couples with foster children, with same-sex couples, same-sex married couples. And I suspect that, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, I think there's an expectation that this conservative court, is going to be very friendly to these religious liberty requests. And possibly in a few years, we're talking about some scenario where a company comes in and says, private company says, our shareholders or our board or our owners have a set of religious beliefs that lead them to, offer medical leave or extra vacation time or health insurance to the married opposite sex partners of our employees, but we will not cover the same-sex partners of our employees, and see how far the court could go in basically saying the state can marry anybody, it has to marry everybody, but you as a private individual, company, institution, church-affiliated institution, do not have to treat them interchangeably.
Yeah, I feel that's why I kind of brought it up, all these things that I was seeing in the news recently, which are obviously not about same-sex marriage, but a different attack on LGBTQ rights and everything. Well, thank you, Sasha, for joining us. I thank you for just talking to me about a wide range of subjects. Tattered Cover readers out there, if you enjoyed this conversation, please check out the engagement, America's Quarter-Century Struggle Over Same-Sex Marriage. Sasha, where can we find you on the internet?
SashaIssenberg.com. So that's my first name and last name.com. And when you buy a book from Tattered Cover, because we're not able to do these book signings in person, if you fill out a form and upload your receipt on my website, I will send you a personally inscribed book plate that you can put in your actual physical book when you get it. So that's SashaIssenberg.com, and then you can find links to me on all the usual social media platforms there too.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Sasha. And thank you everyone for coming to Tattered Cover, a virtual event in the middle of the afternoon. This was great. This was a great way to break up the day and learn a lot. Please visit tatteredcover.com/event for more events. Everyone have a great day and stay safe. Cool. All right. Thank you. Yeah,
awesome.
we're
That was great. Thanks for a good conversation. I really enjoyed that.